We had also hoped that the Honorable Dr. David Monina Sengay, the Chief Minister, Chief Innovation Officer, and former Minister of Basic and Senior Secondary Education, Sierra Leone, would be able to join us for this panel. Unfortunately, the current situation in Sierra Leone prevents him from joining us in person, so he has shared a brief message with us. Please direct your attention to the video screens.
Radical inclusion really means everyone, irrespective of who you are, boy, girl, a child with a disability, somebody who's poor, somebody who lives in a remote area, hard to reach, some parent learner, everybody can be given equal opportunities to access education, to access government services. And for us in Sierra Leone, we got to this concept when at some point pregnant girls and parent learners were not allowed to go to school. And this was an existing ban that had been in place for about 10 years. And we realized that if we really wanted to address access to education for all, we had to make sure that irrespective of who you were, your religion, your tribe, your gender, your socioeconomic class, we had to make sure that you could access education. This concept of radical inclusion has now transcended beyond access to education, and it's how we think about government services to the people. Because at the end of the day, when you build technologies, as an example, that reach the most vulnerable, the hardest to reach, the poor, the women, that technology becomes effective for everybody. A critical example of this was when we developed a solution for parents to check the results of their kids. In the past, it would take up to 10 weeks, cost up to $10, was a challenge. Even if you could afford it, you had to wait to be able to access your child's results. But then because we heard parents who live in hard-to-reach remote areas and their challenges, we decided to build an SMS-based solution where irrespective of who you were, you could send the number of your child who took an exam and you get an SMS back or USSD back. So it was a 2G solution that would work for anybody. And in real time, you can know your child's results. This solution has since been used about 13 million times by pretty much every household. The poor, the wealthy, the people who are in private schools, those who are in government schools, everybody uses it. It really underscored the point for us that when you use technology to drive equity, to drive justice, to bring people together, you solve the problem that works for everybody. This isn't just a framework that we apply when we speak about technology. This is a framework that we apply through public policy, through governance, and we will really stop at nothing until everyone could access these services.
Thank you very much, David. Lucy, let me turn the floor over to you as we get started with our final panel of the night. Thank you.
Thank you, and it's a real pleasure to be able to join you all to discuss radical inclusion. And I want to start by just giving a big thank you to fellow panelists here who joined at very short notice after Minister Sengay was unable to travel to join us. But we really want to get to in this panel is a deeper understanding of what we mean by radical inclusion in education. And I hope that that's something that you all in this room can consider. And we're looking forward to hearing your comments, your questions. So keep them coming in from the outset and we'll be able to turn to those a bit later on in our discussion. But to lay the ground for this panel, I want to start by just sharing one anecdote of what radical inclusion has meant in our organisation, CAMFED. For those of you who are not so familiar with CAMFED, CAMFED supports girls in sub-Saharan Africa, girls who are marginalised, into school, through school, and in the transition beyond school. And radical inclusion was at the centre of a make or break moment that we had in our organisation some time ago. We had been given the opportunity of a grant to really scale our community-led model for girls' education, going from supporting tens of thousands of girls in school to supporting hundreds of thousands of girls in school. Now, it was quite a risk to think about what that would mean for us, because we focus on those who are most marginalised, and to go to scale and to ensure that we could continue to reach those who are most marginalised, that was going to be a challenge. But the real kick came after we had signed the contract, when an additional clause was brought in which said that we would only get the significant proportion of the funding through a payment by results mechanism that was linked to learning outcomes. And the requirement was that the young people that we were supporting would achieve a 0.2 effect size compared with young people in comparison schools over a 2-year period and at secondary education. So that was a huge challenge. Now, the pressure in the face of that challenge is to focus on the marginalized, but not the most marginalized. Because focusing on those who are most marginalized was going to make the task that much harder, was going to make the risk that much bigger, because they were less likely to be able to remain in school and less likely to achieve that kind of learning outcome. So the real pressure we faced was to focus on those who were not so marginalized. But as an organization, we chose to be radical. We chose to direct our support to those who were most marginalized. Girls like Bridget, a girl who was living in a family of a single mother in Zimbabwe. And she said, when I used to have to drop out of school when we ran out of money, I would go and work in people's fields in return for a bucket of maize. And that's what I came to believe I was worth, a bucket of maize. And we recognized that it was one thing to get girls into school, but if we were to achieve real inclusion, participation in which the most marginalized girls could actually engage and learn, that required another dimension of support. It wasn't about hot housing students in academic subjects. We had to deal with the fact that the most marginalized kids were struggling once they were in the classroom to be able to engage and learn. And so we worked on an alternative curriculum, the My Better World curriculum, which would be delivered by young people in the community in an interactive mode of learning. And in developing that curriculum, we drew on the stories of Bridget and those like her to be able to bring to the table some of the challenges that young people were facing in engaging on their learning. And I'll never forget when we introduced that curriculum in another country among some of the cohort that we were working with in Tanzania, and both girls and boys came up when they heard Bridget's story and said, "How did you know my story? Where did you get my story from?" Because for the very first time, they had heard something that resonated with their own experience, unlike the stories, the case studies in so many of their textbooks that were of children who were urban, better off, which was continually reinforcing those kids' own sense of marginalization. So it was a big risk. 2 years on, there was a major evaluation of the outcomes of those kids, and we achieved the 0.2 effect size. So radical inclusion literally paid off in our case. But radical inclusion is hard. Inclusion is something we can all embrace. Radical inclusion is tough. And so I want to, at this point, turn to our panel and to ask you, what does radical inclusion mean to you? Why is it important? And Ruth, if I may start with you.
Thank you. To me, radical inclusion means that no child is learning until all children are learning. And that's not just a political statement. We see it at the household level, where one individual is successful in education, in their career, but the rest of the family have been unsuccessful. The pull-down effect of having to carry the entire family basically reduces the returns to that education of the individual. We see it at the society level, where a large swath of young people don't have the skills, the knowledge to be productive. We see how they become the destructive elements in society. We see it through violence, through political destabilization. And we see it at the global level. Look at all those economic migrants sinking in the Mediterranean Sea, trying to seek better shores. If they were included fully in the education programs of their countries, they would be serving their families, their societies, their countries. So for me, the challenge in education is how do you create a tide that lifts all boats? We've seen several examples of that today, whether it is through the Pratham program that recognizes a gap and tries to fill it, whether it is through your program in Comfort. But I think it's more than that. I think it is not single interventions. We need a comprehensive set of interventions. And in addition to what has been presented today, I would like to focus on two particular issues that perhaps we've not given sufficient attention to. The first is removing the blind spot, bringing to the forefront those who are being left behind. On the 23rd of November, a couple of weeks ago, Kenya released the primary leaving examination results. Out of 1.4 million kids who sat the exams, 27% of them, 380,000 of them, scored basically a guessing mark, less than 300 points. Basically, they had failed. As we celebrated that over 3 days of lots of media bliss and celebration of how well the kids had done, nobody focused on those 380,000 kids who had basically failed. What's going to happen to them? Is there going to be a remedial program for them? What kind of schools are they going to go to? Nobody recognized that these are going to create the pull-down effect that we try to eliminate through education. A different type of blind spot that we sometimes are not aware of. I was sitting in a board meeting a month ago, and we are discussing a cash transfer program that I'm involved in. And somebody pointed out that some money had been given to refugees. And the reaction in the boardroom was electric. Why are we funding refugees? What collateral do they have to pay back the money? Why are we funding refugees? We are going to encourage them not to go back home. And it was a very, very strong and surprising reaction arising from where one was sitting. If you are coming from the financial sector, the concern was how safe is the funding. If you are coming from the government side, the diplomatic side, is refugees by definition should be temporary. Are you now giving them solutions to make them permanent? How do you remove those blind spots to make everybody in that room, in this case, see these individuals who merit as much support as everybody else? And we all suffer from those blind spots depending on where we are sitting. So the first thing is to recognize that even as we are successful in Comfort, even as we are successful in bringing those girls to school, I am quite sure that if you step back, you can see lots of blind spots in that program. Even as we sit in this room, I was sitting there thinking, how many people are being excluded in the discussion we are having today, rich as it is? Where are the students that are the subject of our engagement? Where are the young people who are going to be taking this forward, and so on and so forth? Some exclusions, more serious, more fundamental, more far-reaching than others. And then the final point I want to make in this segment, Lucy, is as we think about inclusion and exclusion, we need to be much more humble about how difficult it is to sustain inclusive policies. It is easy to get the girls into school, and it's important to do so. But once you get them into school, how do you make sure they are learning at the same level as the boys? Once they are in that school, how do you make sure they are getting the same job opportunities, and so on and so forth? In Kenya, the president I was working with was very committed to eliminating female genital mutilation. And he made a commitment that is going to be eliminated in Kenya by 2026. And all systems go to eliminate it. And we did very well on the policy, and everybody was doing what they can. But we realized we have to engage the local leaders, the religious leaders, the traditional leaders in this. And that went very well. Then we realized the rite of passage that underlies FGM has a purpose in the culture, and unless you address it, you are not going, this thing is just going to go underground. So how do you deal with the rite of passage? So we did sort of a symbolic rite of passage so that there's a clear step forward without necessarily doing the surgical part. Then we realized FGM also came with some economic benefits, because after FGM, they were married off to somebody, and there was some economic security for the family. Whatever you think about it, that was the reality. So how do you make sure that you close that economic gap? Otherwise, if it is a net loss to the family, they are not going to comply to the policies. So in this case, in the Samburu County, we introduced bead making, which would adorn them as part of the rite of passage, and then use those beads to sell, and it's now become a big trade and a huge economic activity, the Johari beads, you can look it up. So the point here is, it is not a one-step activity, it is not a one-step intervention, it evolves, and you've got to keep alert to evolving challenges and incorporate them into the program. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth. I think you've raised some critical points there around blind spots, and radical inclusion has to be able to see those blind spots. And your point around linking this into the wider geopolitical issues that we see, and that this is not and never a one-off intervention. This has to be a wider process, an inclusive process. So, Baylor, if I can turn to you to pick up on that and to share your perspectives on radical inclusion and why it's important.
Thank you, Lucy, and it was great to hear David also. Pity he's not here. But on a very personal note, I thought at age 4, when I had to go to a preschool, my father was in prison, my mother was a teacher there, and I had to face a book that I could not understand why my mother was called Mary and why Rover was a dog. I thought I was being radically excluded. And furthermore, at age 6, when I was fined ₹10 for speaking in Urdu, which was my mother tongue, that I had to be, because I had to only speak in English. This is still not too long after independence. I just thought, my God, this is the worst exclusion. How will I fare in this world with these kind of exclusions that are so part of the institutions? So I think with that kind of a that was, I remember that so categorically, and that stayed with me. And when the institution of Idara Talim Agahi, or Center for Education of Consciousness, was made in 2000, that whole issue and seeing the challenge of radical inclusion stayed with us, and that became the reason for us to come into existence and to look for children, especially whether through our evidence, our surveys, or the work that we did targeting girls or in early childhood, we felt that or child labor, that was really the point that we wanted to make to the government, that, these were the elephants in the room. The government was not doing anything. The survey on Asar, Pakistan, for example, for the income quartiles showed very obviously there was a 20% gap between girls and boys in the poorest household just for enrollment, leave alone for learning. So that, became a very precise target group. Or going to villages where almost every girl was being married off at 15, 14, 12. That became an issue that, how do we target precisely, exactly as in Campfed, that particular target group which really needed urgent attention. and issues of disability. So when it was gender, it was not just girls, it was then girls with disability, minorities, the pivoting with migration, and many other challenges that came in front of us. So how do you deal with that complexity when you are targeting issues of exclusion in that way? It has to be a radical inclusion strategy. As a commissioner in the Education Commission, if you remember the Learning Generation report in 2016, we had that notion of progressive universalism. And the idea was exactly that. How do you target those who are at the nexus of multiple disadvantages and just become totally invisible? How do you address issues which are coming in your government data, which is looking at, this is, administrative data of labor force surveys of 10 to 17 children who are already admitted and going into millions. So I think the issue of identifying that is a very, very strong one where there is evidence, where you see them, now you don't, or child domestic labor. So I think those became the reason for us to target almost every program that we were doing or every research that we were conducting to see where that evidence lay. And I think that therefore, then the work that we do, whether it is from service delivery or capacity building, but more importantly, taking the evidence back to the government to say, this is what the face of radical inclusion or exclusion looks like, and what do you do, how do you come up with those strategies to address that? And I think that frames the way we move forward in just about everything that we do. But I want to suggest and emphasize that when we are dealing with that, as you must have seen, as Ruth has seen in Kenya, that it comes with multiple spaces and multiple dimensions. It is not, we're talking about education as one sector, but when we're talking about issues of exclusion, we are talking about a multi-sectoral approach that we need to define how that really manifests itself. And I think that has been a very challenging aspect to look at, and the framing of exclusion from a multi-sectoral 360-degree lens, which often gets ignored. And that's because, and we'll come to that later as well, but every time you look at those groups, you know that it is not just about issues of exclusion from schools or learning. It's about birth registration, it is about stunting, it is about early child marriages, it is about livelihoods and poverty, and also the issues of what happens in the homes and society, and of course the schools and workplaces. So I think that somehow or the other we need to look at in the way we approach the issues of radical inclusion. And I managed to read the book, which was absolutely brilliant, but to see that, the issue is not of one sector. The issue has to begin somewhere, but it has to address the other issues that come along with it, which make it so much more complex and so multi-layered. Thank you.
Thanks, Bela. And I think your points around the intersectionality of the issues that interplay in exclusion is key. And I think an important point you're making there as well is around the quality of the data, the availability of the data for us to be able to gain insight into some of those blind spots that Ruth shared. Angie, if I can come to you.
Sure, Lucy, thank you so much. I'm going to take you a little bit to my village. In 1992, in December, at a school called Arima Primary School, I collected my end of primary school leaving certificate results. I had the best possible results anybody could have. And the school administration had come, so he had a couple of parents to celebrate this feat, because it was the first time anybody at my school had had such high results. For me, I started crying. And everybody was like, oh, she's overwhelmed. No, I wasn't overwhelmed. I wasn't overwhelmed by how well I had done. For me, this was the end of the road. I had promised myself that I knew I would not go to high school. This was the best I could do, and I had done my part. So I was crying from relief that I've done what I set out to do. This is it. And this was not for lack of commitment from my mom and my dad. They did everything that they could, at times nearly starving everybody to be able to pay for the stationery that I needed at primary school. It wasn't for lack of commitment from my school teachers and heads. They did all they could, providing me with stationery and all of that when I needed it. Why am I sharing this with you? Because I know what it means to be excluded. I know that. I know the anxiety, the palpitations, the sense of feeling like I don't belong here, I'm not needed, I'm probably in the wrong place. Maybe I was born into the wrong family, born in the wrong planet, and you don't just know what to do. That's the challenge of being excluded. So for me, radical inclusion is very personal. I love to talk about millions of girls who can support billions and trillions. But I always want us, when you talk about radical inclusion, to always think about each and every child. For me, radical inclusion is a world in which each and every child is educated, is protected, is respected, is valued, and can grow up to be whoever they want to be in whatever way. For me, radical inclusion is not some veiled exclusion, which is inclusion which has got all these conditionalities. The fact that, if a girl is pregnant, all of a sudden education is considered not important or their conditions set. For me, radical inclusion in education means that we hold education as sacred, regardless of who I'm born to, my abilities or disabilities, who is my parent. As a child, they know that their sacred right to education is protected. They don't have to be afraid it will be taken away. So for me, radical inclusion sounds very idealistic, sounds very naive, because we are not radically looking at radical inclusion. It should not be naive. It should not be sounding idealistic. It should be as normal as just drinking water. That's what radical inclusion is. To tell every child that they belong to this world, regardless of how they ended up here. That's what radical inclusion for me means.
Thanks, Angie. And I think we've heard here some of the real, the intersectionality, the complexity of this issue of radical inclusion, and the fact that it is not a one-off solution. And Ruth, if I can turn to you to consider what the challenges you would see as a policymaker in addressing the issue of radical inclusion.
Thank you, Lucy. That's where the rubber meets the road. It's very easy to identify at least the glaring levels of exclusion. It's relatively easy to even come up with basic policies to address it. It's very difficult to implement it in a sustainable manner. In 2020, when the schools closed down in, I think, March 2020, we had, in Kenya, distributed tablets, about 2 million tablets for the digital learning program. And they were being used quite effectively. And we were feeling very good as policymakers that we have made, lots of progress in digital education. Our kids have become 21st century learners and so on and so forth. When the schools shut down in March 2020, all the teachers locked up the tablets. They cannot send them home with the kids because they'll get damaged. So we moved in one day from having a progressively successful digital learning program to going back to 19th century using the radio and TV to do distance learning that was occasioned by COVID. So in one day, we sort of made major reversals on what had been good progress. So a key challenge for policymakers is how to sustain implementation, how to build on small incremental steps. Second, we visited one of the most successful schools in one of the poorest parts of Kenya. It was a boarding school for girls, very successful. So we go there, it's very clean, very well maintained. You walk in and everything is in order. And I'm walking around the school and I look at the notice board and I noticed that 12 months before, there was 420 girls in the school, and now there are about 300. I thought it was a typo. So I asked, what has happened to these girls? Oh, they have been withdrawn. Why? A beautiful new road had just been constructed, and little shops and industries were beginning to develop along the new road. So there were job opportunities. So some had gone to take up the new job opportunities. Second, the school for 2 years in a row had performed very poorly. So parents had lost confidence in the school. So they were withdrawing the girls, basically to go and get them married off. Because this West Pokot, it had required a lot of effort to get them to school. So if we had not visited that school, in our books, it was showing it is one of our best schools in terms of resources, in terms of sort of leadership. But when you look at the fine print, it was falling apart. So how do you maintain an effective level of supervision and oversight to make sure that slippages and unintended consequences are addressed in real time? Finally, in the FGM program that I mentioned, in the most recent demographic and health survey, we found that in those same counties that we had put so much effort into to address the issue of FGM, the demographic health survey demonstrated that 45 in one case and 47% in another case of girls 15 to 19 years had been pregnant. And you say, what is going on here? What did we miss? So again, the risk that policymakers fall into in this situation, whether it is in the classroom or outside it, is to declare victory too soon and to stop keeping a focus on sort of the day-to-day evolution of the policy.
Thanks, Ruth. And I think from what you've shared there, you've demonstrated that you may achieve what can be seen as inclusion, but that it is vulnerable, that, in many respects, one can go backwards. And just achieving it in one dimension, if you're not looking at it in the round, it's vulnerable. So, Angie, I think Ruth was picking up there that as well, that it doesn't just sit with the policymakers, it's also about how other stakeholders, how other actors are coming into play around radical inclusion. And I wonder if you could share some perspectives on what some of the challenges are that you see in achieving radical inclusion.
Sure, Lucy, thanks so much. And Ruth, I liked it when you said that they declared victory too soon. I think we have a lot of that. And unfortunately, at times the philanthropy sector doesn't help. And Lucy, you were talking earlier on about, we need payment by results, or we need these results by these 3 weeks, or these 3 years, or these 4 years. At times that promotes a culture of superficial inclusion because people want to keep an impression of progress when there's no progress. Anyway, some of the challenges that are there in achieving radical inclusion includes, first and foremost, what I want to call othering, where you go to government officials and they will say to you, oh, civil society, you think you know it all, you are not listening or you are the cause of the problem. Civil society says, government, you are not listening. Teachers say parents don't support the education of their children. Parents say teachers do not involve us. Some say, oh, you're focusing too much on boys. Some say there is just way too much othering. It's them, it's them, it's them. Nobody's looking in the mirror and saying, what do I have to do to achieve radical inclusion within my space? The truth of the matter is no one person, no one entity, no one sector is going to achieve radical inclusion, because at times children are just hungry, they want food. At times they don't have birth certificates, so they are not registered. And at times there is issues around nutrition, and at times it's learning pedagogy that's off. The issue is, for us to achieve radical inclusion, we need to get over the challenge of othering and actually thinking my way is the only way, or I know better, and this is the only way that it can be done. Secondly is the issue of precedence. This is precedence in terms of people, processes, practices, and policies and programs, where we think because I've got this, everybody else doesn't have a model, I'm going to tell you what to do and how to do it. Then you have a lot of resistance because people have got their own plans that they were working on and something that they think will work. So this whole issue around who is the teacher, who is the learner, will not. So there are precedence issues around systems change, radical inclusion. We need to be able to recognize that there is no empty vacuum which is waiting to be filled. There is mutual learning. How do we achieve that? Third, and probably the most important, in our attempt to achieve radical inclusion, we need to remember what this is about. By the end of the day, it is about us, but it's not about us. It is about children, it is about young people. How do we remain accountable to that mission, to them, and not to our model, not to our policy, not to, how do we remain accountable to what we are collectively, all of us, trying to achieve? And I just want to say something very quickly. You're talking about COVID. When COVID hit in most of the communities that we work in, Comfort works in Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, Tanzania, and Ghana. And we work in the most marginalized communities. Comfort supported girls, myself included, are among the first in their communities to have gone that high. So when COVID hit, a lot of aid workers who were parachuted into the communities left to be with their families and everything. And who held fort? It was girls and young women who graduated from the program, who took up learning, who took up teaching, who took up social support and counseling of students to be able to keep them in school. As a result of it, over 90% of our students came back to school. In some contexts, it was as high as 98%. Why am I saying this? And okay, by the way, I just want to be able to say that actually that alumni network is over 250,000 young women. We're talking about critical mass. It's 250,000 young women that would never have gone through high school had they not gotten the support that they needed. Why am I sharing this? Radical inclusion takes people that have also lived it and experienced it, and ensuring that they also work with other global partners and influencers to be able to bring the change that they need. You need to remember that they are not projects, they are not beneficiaries, they are not products, they're activists in their own right. And if you work with them, you can achieve such high retention even in COVID. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks, Angie. I think your point around local leadership, going back to some of what we were hearing this morning, and the importance of those who've experienced it, who understand from intimate experience what exclusion, what inclusion means, and to be in leadership positions, to be a driving force in this agenda is key. But Bailey, if I can come to you here, and particularly in relation to policies and what you see are the challenges are in addressing and taking on the agenda of radical inclusion.
So I just want to pick on the earlier comments also, but I wanted to, for us, a great example was the government addressing the COVID challenge so successfully. It was incredible that how the government had an active database, an active tracker program, all sat together in a federation which generally doesn't get along, but for this existential crisis, They managed this so well. And we held that and we said, if you can do that for this, surely for right to education, which actually entered the Constitution in 2010, why are you unable to attend to this? But I think the question is that every time, so on the one hand, how do policies work? So policies work often, of course, they say you have to be data-driven, you have to show it by example, you have to do all of that. But we felt also that for 50,000 girls that we'd worked from 2018 to 2021, in the Siani Saheliyan, the Wise Friends program, they were exactly like these girls who were completely marginalized and had come up to a level whom we are still tracking, by the way, who could become voices in their own right, so that when policymakers at the district level or the provincial level, they could come and speak of what a program which was combining academic, non-academic, life skills, livelihoods, all together, how they could become voices and have agency of what transformation had taken place in their own lives. Also not in their own lives, but also lives of the other generations, their parents who earlier thought that they were completely, they had to be the last person, to receive their meal or have their inoculation or whatever. So policy, I think, works at both levels and opportunistically, especially when you have erratic political regimes. One is coming, the other one is going, which we have all the time. But to be able to show to policymakers that you can act even at the local levels when you can you look at the issue of exclusion as an existential crisis in Pakistan? Can you come together to make the kind of action? So in a federation, in some of the provinces, they took really positive action, starting second shift schools, trying to do something so that we could connect the social protection program, giving them benefits which were linked to some actions, so that if the girls were going to school or the boys were going to school amongst the most poverty-ridden communities, they could be given the social safety nets. The instruments were made for that. So we've seen pockets of great policy making, but at the same time, we've also seen, as Angeline pointed out, the othering story, where you see the parents, having cultures inside the homes where the girls are excluded, where it's easy to marry off girls, and so on. So happening to change cultures and creating enabling environments where parents could see that and everyone could see around in the community, that if there was an enabling environment, if the school was near, if there was a learning taking place, they would definitely send their children to school. So I think it was also, policies happen in a space where the demand and supply do have a conversation with each other, where there is a voice from the demand side that does influence policy. It's not just civil society, it's also what is being demanded from the voter bank, so to speak. And because you have elections coming every now and then, you need that voice that becomes very important. So from policy briefs to evidence to looking at opportunities, and that's something that organizations like ours and others who become interlocutors between policymakers, and I often say it's not just the issue of political will, it's an issue of bureaucratic will also. Sometimes the political will is eager to take action, but the bureaucratic will just backs off, thinking that accountability is that something, a decision-making by a politician may not really hold, and they will be held accountable, and some accountability drive will hold them responsible, so better not take action. So I think this issue of policy and political decision-making has to take into account all these different stakeholders, which are very critical. And organizations like us who've been working, 90% with the government, every bit of our information is in the economic survey, whatever we do. The government benchmarks the data that we collect. So I think that's also very important. How do you get the evidence that you collect? How do you get that to be projected in the sector plans, in the policy documents, which are becoming more and more iterative, but also trying to see where those pockets of actions could be at more decentralized levels. So we've seen a mixture of some great things happening, but at the same time, when it comes to two departments, say, of disability and education work together, they may come up, and even of women development. So you have the great law passed of raising the age of child marriage, but the implementation becomes very difficult when you see that these people generally, there's a tendency that while the Planning and Development Department of the ministry gets everyone together on issues of child nutrition, early childhood education, mothers' support, etc. But when it comes to action, the culture of not working together means that the poorest and those who are likely to be radically included cannot be radically included. Those characteristics or cultures remain to be a big challenge. And of course, when the government is like other countries, when they are making some great policy and they can see early results, they will announce great successes. But at the same time, do they have the capacity to sustain those successes? Do we see that become a part of their planning and budgeting process? So all of us, I think many organizations, including what Rukmini said earlier, that when it comes to data, the evidence, we follow the budget cycle, we follow the planning cycle, we let the data come out when it should be coming out, but we do not know in the complexity of the political instability of the country and the challenges that we face, whether in fact they will actually be factored into the next budget or the next planning process. So it remains a very jittery process. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, we are seeing some data moves. We are seeing things happen. We are seeing in some provinces action and improvement, where we do also have the large heart to be able to say to policymakers, well done, you've done it. See where your data is. And we have seen the gender parity indexes, and we've seen all of that improve wherever the government has taken action, because our biggest challenge is at the post-primary level. At primary level, but also post-primary levels, when there are not enough facilities, and therefore we see that girls completely slip. When from being included, they become excluded again. That aspect of this vulnerability, even though you think you've made it, you have, as I think, you've reached some level of equality, but you've not reached equity. And I think those are very big challenges for us. And we continue to work, but I think we can safely say that we are seeing policymakers and parliamentarians becoming more savvy at looking at data, at looking at evidence, provided the data sheet is short, it's to the point, they can make a position or statement, it can get them some votes, which is just perfectly fine by us, that the best votes can be coming from education. But when it comes to working together on something like this, as an existential crisis, as COVID was, we are still not seeing that, but we know that the capability exists to come together and to do something as fine as they did during the COVID emergency. But we see that in the climate change emergency, where 60% of the schools were damaged and learning really took a back seat in the province of Sindh, that energy does not sustain. What do we do with that? And that, for people like us who are sitting in the government offices, I think 50% of the time, trying to make that, making our influence and evidence felt, I think the glass is still half full.
Mm. Thanks, Bela. And I want to pick up with you, Ruth, on some of the points that Bela has just raised there about the democratic demand, but the bureaucratic hurdles and the incentive around people coming together, achieving alignment. What would be your reflections on how to achieve that, how to bring people together around that call to action for radical inclusion?
Thank you. Before I respond to that, and I will, I would like us to sort of remember that most of the people in this room are educators, some of whom who have had very long and rich experiences in the education sector. And I would like for a moment for us to focus on the classroom. What is not happening in the classroom to bring us the kind of data we are seeing where 80%, 90% of 10-year-olds cannot read a simple text. Something is not right. We have achieved inclusion without achieving inclusion. So what should change in the classroom to reduce that number? And as Michelene was talking this morning about this very exciting program, the ICAP, which that resonates with me, what went through my mind, Michelene, is as the kids are in the interactive mode, how do you make sure that it's not only the introverts, the kids that are confident, that are interacting, how do you make sure that the more introverted and sometimes the more thoughtful of the learners are also included in that interaction? What needs to change in the teacher training program to make sure that it's true inclusion at that micro interactive level in the classroom? And secondly, I think we are at a point in education discourse nationally and globally where the real gap, in my view, is not understanding what policies are required. We know we need to do something about teachers. We even have a sense of what we should do to improve teacher education. We have a good sense of what good textbooks look like. We even have a good sense of what should be happening in schools in terms of inclusion, in terms of administration, engagement with parents, and so on. We've made progress on that. Where I feel we are still piloting blind without a radar is what really works. What makes a difference between classroom A or school A that is achieving stellar results and school B, which has very, very similar set of resources, that is not doing well? And how do we shift that balance to make sure that all learners are learning at a similar level? And I think it behoves us as education researchers, education policymakers, to begin to assemble the data of what truly works in terms of improving learning outcomes. In terms of bringing together policymakers, what has been amazing is to see how when what we are saying resonates with parents or policymakers, it's completely unsortable. And I think one of the speakers this morning, Pratham, made that point clear that once people see it is working and they feel they can do it, it sort of becomes self-reinforcing. So it is how you communicate with policymakers. And it brings to mind sort of a very sober experience I had in my earlier years at the World Bank. When South Africa opened up, we went there with full steam to try and support them become fully democratized. And we felt that one of the most important contributions we could make as World Bank is to support them address the issue of inequality, which was sort of glaring. So we put together a world-class team. Even the Nobel Prize winner, Amartya Sen, was part of the team. And we went there with all the confidence that can only come from the World Bank, telling them, if you address inequality, you're going to solve the problems of this country. And they were very upset. This is a country on the cusp of opening up, of democratizing, and what they were looking for was not bad news. What they were looking for is not to be told what is wrong with their country, it is how to do it. We did a very good study, but nobody looked at it until many, many years later. With the wisdom of hindsight today, we would have done that study, it would have had a transformative effect if we had been more sensitive and better aligned to the political emotions and sentiments of that time. if he had used the right entry point, people who sort of resonated with what we were saying. And this is a mistake where sometimes we make, where we are misaligned in terms of the political mood. If you talk to Minister Senge today, political inclusion, radical inclusion, may not be what is at the top of his mind today, given what is happening politically. It will become important, but you've got to be sensitive to the reality of the day. And we are not often sensitive enough as outside forces and supporters in terms of creating that demand. So I was having a conversation with some partners recently. The African Union has declared 2024 the Africa Year of Education. And there's a lot of energy going on to say, how do we make the Africa Year of Education 2024 a consequential year? And we are looking at the issues that should be addressed that would make a difference in terms of advancing education as an engine for economic transformation and all those nice things that come with education. And people are pushing for that highlighting foundational learning, and it is important, and we need to do foundational learning. And I say to them, do you expect a president to go home and tell his people that from now on we are going to focus on foundational learning alone? When the shoe is biting on jobs, the shoe is biting on technical vocational education. So it's how we message, we communicate the messages in a manner that empowers the leaders, that empowers the parents. And we don't sometimes have that sensitivity to kind of walk in their shoes. We want to sort of impose on their shoes. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth. Well, I'd like to pass to Angie to pick up from there. And this issue of reading the political mood, but also really reading, to Ruth's point there, around walking in their shoes and at community level, and how do you bring these issues to the table and, yeah, ensure that people are coming together, are aligned around what's possible.
Sure, Lucy, thanks so much. And Ruth, you should have seen me nodding. It reminds me of there's this lizard in my village that keeps doing this. So I'm feeling like that. So Ruth, I like when you talk about reading the mood in any situation, because I think that's the most important thing. Social and emotional intelligence as you collaborate and engage for radical inclusion. It's not stupidity. It's not, for lack of a better word, compromising. It doesn't mean that you're not driving for radical inclusion. It means that you care so much to set it up for success. That's crucial and that's critical. And just to say bottom line, for all those words around social emotional reading is respect. It's respect for where people are at, what they understand, what they need, what they prioritize, what they are trying to deliver, and build on from that, rather than assuming they don't know. And I just want to say this is one of the areas as an organization we have greatly benefited from, but also greatly leveraged, to the point that we have got respect from the very communities that we work with, the parents who, when you start working with them, they themselves feel so intimidated and so ashamed of the fact that they can't afford the school-going costs for their children, to the, like topmost people in government and everybody. The most important thing is respect, is to respect the vision that they've got for themselves, the struggles that they've got, and to be able to say, as we say at Camfed, pamoja tunaweza, which is together we can solve this. We are not coming here with a solution. We're not coming to tell you how badly you are doing or what you should do. The issue is, how do we work together to do this? So I just want to be able to say collaboration is non-negotiable. And collaboration doesn't mean getting buy-in. It means collaborating. Collaborating with people from the design of understanding the problems, of setting the agenda, of what to measure, who to involve, when to involve them, what to do, and all of that. It's collaboration. It's not once in a while trip to the village to tell them what they need. It's not, I can go on and on. Collaboration, right? And it's collaboration both for practitioners, for policymakers, for researchers, for everybody. It's collaboration with one North Star. Do you agree on where you are trying to go to? How do you collaborate to get there? It means that there will be confusions. There will be some who will be coming and saying, can you please prove that it's cost effective? Some will be coming and say, what is the ethical dilemma here? Some will come and say, our culture doesn't allow this. You need to look for that sweet, beautiful spot that allows for radical inclusion. Because at times, you're just speaking in different languages, but you're all talking about the same thing. And I can just point to other things that I think are essential as well, is to be able to put the most marginalized child at the center. The challenge we've got with national averages is they hide some of the blind spots and some of the corners. Some of you might be shocked that for the most marginalized children in Africa, 95% never make it through secondary school. I'll say that again. 95% of children from the most marginalized families, from the resource-poor families in sub-Saharan Africa, never make it through secondary school. But when you look at the national averages and the national statistics, they look more positive. So as you program, as you design, as you do all this, can you think about that particular child who is invisible, who is forgotten, who is not being seen, who is not on the table? If you design for them, it will work for any other child. Because it is those children that continue to be left behind because their story is considered too complex, they've got too many needs, and all of that. So always program for the most marginalized child. And finally, radical inclusion is radical. It's not apologetic, it's bold. And don't settle for anything less. And as you go for it, remember respect. You get more with honey than vinegar. Together we can.
Thanks, Angie. We're going to pick up some of the questions that are coming through from the room, and please do keep them coming. And one of those relates to the anecdote that Minister Senge shared, which was around the use of technology in sharing information with parents and leapfrogging some of the challenges around ensuring that they have data on their children's performance. And I wonder, you know, this is open to any of you, what role do you see for technology in promoting radical inclusion, particularly for those who are the most marginalized and excluded? And do you feel there's a role for technology? I would add that.
I just wanted to quickly come up on that. During emergencies, suddenly we know that technology leapfrogged. And from very simple technology like SMS and WhatsApp all the way up. But one of the very exciting pieces of policy was that almost all the social safety nets would go via the females in the households. And that meant that even where there were shared telephones, or sorry, mobile phones or smartphones, that it would have to be the woman who would have to look at it and to see whether her NIC, the identity card was there and she'd got the message or not. And I think that became a great moment, not only for us who were also exploring and working with SMSs and WhatsApp on learning, but also to get the possibilities of getting their social safety nets because it was coming to women. And it certainly meant that your status had been elevated. Now, that, I think one of our biggest success stories has been the CNIC, the Nadra cards, where the ID cards are so powerful. And that's why when there is a birth registration gap and so on and so forth, that worries us. And that's it. But technology not only did that, but it also meant when 4 months after, during COVID, after COVID, the government said, get all the WhatsApp numbers of the parents. For the first time, the school and the home was being bridged. Otherwise, they were two separate entities. Nobody really knew the other. The kid went to school, the kid came back. So it changed that whole culture of teaching learning on the one hand, on the other hand, providing support to the most excluded, and the possibilities of technology, which were already happening earlier, really got accelerated. Organizations like ours and many others who worked in this space use then the SMS, the WhatsApp, for ensuring continuity of learning. And we did take measures to see how actually some of the learning was sustained. Not only that, but when the schools did open, you again saw a big demand from kids who were not staying at home. We saw for early childhood some slipping, but for primary age children, we saw actually a lot more children returning when the schools had properly opened. So I think technology in its, with, not the most complicated one, but certainly SMSs, WhatsApp, and of course, the government use of technology in being able to show their trackers, etc., that also came in handy. Suddenly, the society has become more savvy in technology and knows actually how to have their voices heard. The unheard voices, which we had never heard, they suddenly found a voice. Even in the most remote village, you would be hearing stories. And of course, we had other concerns of digital safety, etc. But we saw that technology did give space, voice, agency. But at the same time, a huge note of caution that didn't mean that we were reaching everyone. Those who were most excluded perhaps remained excluded. And we need to be able to think how to work with technology on those particular measures. But we've seen a huge boom in Pakistan for lots of technology providers who are not looking at enterprise with profit, but those who are looking at technology as a way for public service and public goods.
And did you want to comment on that? And then I'll pass to Ruth for another question that's come in related to policy.
Sure, and I'll keep it very short because Bela, you covered, I think all the key essentials. What I just wanted to build on from, which Ruth said earlier on, is that needs to be done with a lot of social and emotional intelligence and with understanding of the local context. Because as Ruth mentioned earlier on, when COVID hit in Kenya, what the school administration saw was an opportunity to preserve this rare resource and make sure it wasn't damaged, instead of letting the students use it. So we need, as we look at technology, we need to also appreciate that in resource-poor communities, this technology or gadgets, hardware, whatever, will be worshipped in such a manner that it might end up actually displacing other needs and priority for children. I've got a great example in one of the countries where we work in, where schools started taking resources away from what they used to give students to actually trying to have the fuel for the generator for the computers, to build a stronger computer room which will not be broken into. So by the time they were finished, 3/4 of their budget was gone. It wasn't the students, it was important. So, and also another thing is, technology is a tool. It will reinforce your key organizing principles. If you don't use it, if you don't have a design that's radically inclusive, it will be a weapon for exclusion. So you need to be very careful and cautious about that. If you're not aware of gender dynamics within a community, within a family, and you give technology, it can actually fuel gender dynamics. So technology on its own as a standalone will not be adequate. It needs to be introduced with an understanding around the context it is. We have used it as an organization amazingly for connecting our activists and our network, for ensuring they've got the information and resources and support that they need. But remember, technology is a tool. It doesn't work on its own. So you need to continue to design intelligently.
I just wanted to say that the number of storytelling and stories that we collected during this period was also enormous. In terms of social emotional learning and so on, it was almost a great healer, but that meant the simplest of the technologies and how it came back to us.
Thanks, and I think, Andrew, you touched on the issue of cost, and the final question to you, Ruth, is that radical inclusion, achieving radical inclusion, is often seen as very costly because those who are most marginalized may need that additional support. So given the squeeze in public funding available for education, what would you prioritize as a policymaker in achieving radical inclusion?
I think it's President Nyerere who said, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. I don't think we should be worried about that. As Angie rightly said, if you focus on the most marginalized, the most in need, then you include everybody. This is where I'm challenging us as an education community to begin to document and to disseminate what works, not just in terms of improving learning outcomes, but doing so in a cost-effective manner. And we are seeing a lot of that happening. You know, some of the presentations this morning, some of the work Pratham is doing, what Michelin is doing, is beginning to get at that. You're beginning to improve learning outcomes. You're beginning to improve inclusion in a cost-effective manner. That is the key word. On technology, I'm actually a big believer in technology. I believe it is as close to a silver bullet. I know somebody this morning said, don't look for silver bullets, but it is a tool that we have not fully harnessed. Much as we need to harness it wisely, I agree, it is a tool that we have not harnessed. And I actually commend the Yidan Prize Foundation for having awarded the science PhD program. Anecdotally, when I learned about it, I called my grandchildren. The older one, they had been using it on off. He was, nothing home to write about. The younger one hadn't heard about it. He said, well, but it must be very expensive. I said, no, it is free. Half an hour later, he calls me and he said, this thing is so exciting. I just launched a little girl into space. Yeah. And, what was exciting about that response is how it releases the imagination. It enables the child to basically let go, basically see the possibilities. And I think there's scope there. The risk, of course, is that not every child has a computer in front of them that they can access this. But I've been impressed at what that program is doing to try and make offline programs and make them more accessible. Secondly, technology can be the great leveler, particularly for teachers who are not very well trained. You prepare the materials in a central manner, in a central place, and then disseminate them for them to use them in schools. You help to close some of the gaps in skills and capacity in schools. Finally, as the ecosystem, the technological ecosystem improves, you also make it more accessible. I don't think using the telephones as they are now is good enough. You can't download even a 2-minute video, let alone a 10-minute video with the telephones that they have. And to Angela's point, we discovered during COVID that when fathers who have the better phones came home, they would give them to the boys to do their homework with. So, it introduces a whole range of issues. But that can be overcome by improving the footprint, the technology footprint. And once you do that, then the hard gadgets become invaluable tools for sharing information, for reducing intellectual isolation, even for university students, as we found. And finally, I was reviewing some proposals. It was really a competition by a tech hub to see what innovations can improve education. And we had about 89 submissions, and we were supposed to select 10. And I was impressed at the range of opportunities for innovation through technology. A small technology that helps to translate language, making it much easier to bridge the gap between local language and English or French. It's absolutely revolutionary. A small program that enables teachers to communicate with parents, and so on and so forth. Very simple, but addressing real-life issues in the classroom. So used well, technology can provide the great leap forward that we seek, but it should not be done sort of as a matter of course. It needs to be sensitively applied, and this is the team that can take that forward.
Thanks, Ruth. I think ending on that note of going from radical inclusion to releasing possibility, I think is a great note to end on. I just want to leave the last word with Minister Senge, our absent panelist, from his book. He said that part of radical inclusion involves the ability to identify and then establish a coalition, which is essential, whether you're a leader of an organization or an institution, or just an ordinary citizen with a desire to change your community in any way and at any scale. Even if you have the power to push through change, a strong, broad-based coalition is almost always necessary for the change to be sustainable. And I would pay tribute to Dr. Charles Ten Yidan and the Yidan Prize Foundation, because I think this is all about building a coalition that can come together, that can achieve radical inclusion and radical results in education. So thank you to our panelists for sharing your reflections.